Hi, everybody. Hi, Lygia. Hi, Virginia.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'll start. Welcome to the fifth week of the Impact Festival and to this morning's very exciting panel. We've got a feisty crew who is going to be nothing if not entertaining. And I'm glad to be here with you. This is Linda Gibbs. I am a new friend of the Center for Homelessness Impact. I met Ligia right before lockdown happened in a trip to the UK where I've been working with the GLA on some of their homelessness challenges. I'm a principal at Bloomberg Associates, which is a consulting group that works with mayors internationally. And my focus is on the health and human services. My experience in doing this work was the deputy mayor for Health and Human Services in New York City under the mayoralty of Mike Bloomberg, and had been his homeless commissioner when he started as mayor. And we're joined today. This is a conversation innovation. What is it and why is it good for you? It sounds a little bit like, it's a bottle of medicine. Do you really want to take it? We have a great panel. We're going to start with Tendai Vicky, who is the author and of two books that are too far away, framed on his office walls that you can't actually read them, but those are the covers of his two acclaimed books on innovation. He is an associate partner at Strategizer. And then after we hear from Tendai, we will hear from Marisi Vinton, who is now leading Ada's List. She was a co-founder and then did some work in the Obama administration, in the women in the tech world, more power to us. And now leading Ada's List. And she's gonna be the first of the two respondents to Tendai's comments, and followed by the Alison Watson, the director of Shelter Scotland, and who has led a good part of her career in working in the shelter services world. And so this is going to be a super discussion. We look forward to your comments, and let me hand it over to Tendai.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a really great pleasure to be here. I don't typically give these sorts of talks. I'm usually with large corporations, so it'll be really interesting to see how this conversation pans out, right? And so I'm going to be talking to you about innovation and what it is good for. I'm really tempted to sing that song about war and what it's good for, but I won't do that to you right now because I'd like you to stay sane. But the conversation I want to have with all of you is just to share some of the learnings we've been having about what's really great in innovation practice. How do you do innovation really well? How do you collaborate with teams? And how do you create value, right? Rather than creating noise. And some of this work is part of my book called Pirates in the Navy. And that's deliberate, right? The notion of pirates in the Navy is actually deliberate because innovators tend to call themselves pirates a lot. And when that happens, it's more noise, more disruption, more chaos. And what we really want to focus on is doing the kinds of innovation that create value for the organizations that we work with. And so I'm going to talk you through a set of principles. So I'm going to present a principle, and then we'll have a conversation, and I'll present another principle, and we'll have a conversation. So the first principle that I want to share with you is that every organization on the planet, regardless of what business you're in or whatever it is that you're doing, should always have two portfolios, right? And the two portfolios, we'll call them exploration and exploitation. And this is a concept that was first sort of originated by James G. March, who's a professor of Stanford. And James G. March says the basic problem confronting every organization is to engage in sufficient exploitation to make sure that it sort of ensures its current viability and its current impact, to make sure that it sort of sustains its current success, but at the same time devote enough energy to exploring future opportunities and future viability. So this is the balance that we have to strike in our organizations. And so what really most people struggle with is making this distinction between exploration and exploitation, and innovation actually covers the whole spectrum. So there's like crazy innovation, right? That is like way over here and you're coming up with moonshot ideas and people are like, oh, we don't want to do that because it'll ruin everything. And then there's efficiency innovation, which is more sane and it's over here. And what you're doing is you're optimizing systems. And I think early on when we're having a conversation, we're like, well, sometimes governments can get too focused on crazy innovation and then they forget to do the work to optimize their systems. And what we want is what we call the balanced portfolio. So we want a balance between the two things so that we're working on things that create value on both ends of the spectrum. And so what people really struggle with though, when it comes to doing innovation is that they tend to take the practices and behaviors that they use during the exploitation side of the business and try to apply them to the innovation side. And so the first poll that I'd like to launch for you guys to respond to is, which of these words do you think characterize the exploration side? So if we could launch that poll, do we think it's predictability? Do we think it's uncertainty? Do we think it's planning, risk-taking, efficiency? You can choose multiple of these. So it's very interesting just to see what people think in terms of what characterizes exploration, the explore side of an organization's portfolio. You get about 30 seconds really to vote.
I resent as a panelist that I can't vote.
All right. Well, you can just say what you think.
I need to do a little exploration of this strategy.
That's true. I think that's deliberate. We don't want you ruining the poll. Right. Thank you very much. You can stop the poll and just share the results there so that everyone can see. So you can see that risk-taking is right at the top of that, right? People are identifying risk-taking. Searching is another one. Uncertainty is definitely a characteristic of the exploration portfolio. So we really need to be thinking about that, because if you say, oh yeah, risk-taking and uncertainty are what defines exploration, and then you tell people before we launch this, we need to build a roadmap and make a really, really detailed plan, then you're really kind of breaking, you know, the practices that you need to be involved in. So yeah, you can stop sharing that now so I can move on with the presentation. But you can see that, you know, the focus is actually different. On the explore side, the focus is searching and creating new breakthroughs. On the exploit side, it's sort of, you know, efficiency and sort of managing growth or managing your existing. Uncertainty is high on one dimension and low on the other. The financial philosophy sometimes can actually be different, right? So we don't want to make big bets on our innovation projects. We want to make small incremental bets. Whereas when, you know, on the other side, we can focus on impact and make big bets because we know that these things work. You know, the culture and processes are different. So it's iterative and experimentation on the one side, and then on the other side, you can focus on execution and predictability. And then the types of people you also need are kind of different. You need explorers who excel who are comfortable with ambiguity on the one side. And then on the other side, you need people that are really comfortable with sort of planning and sort of execution, right? Or at least optimizing efficiencies. And so you can see here that, you know, the squiggly line gets straight as you get closer to the exploit side, right? And then you're like kind of managing growth or impact, if you want to say that. And over here, you're actually managing searching. And so what then matters is that you need to visualize it as two portfolios. And that's what we do at Strategize, is we create visualization. And when you visualize it as two portfolios, what that allows you to do is start thinking about what you're managing. So in the exploit portfolio, you're really managing how much impact your organization is currently having and the risk that that impact can get disrupted by events. That's what you're really paying attention to in terms of your existing programs. On the explore side, you're really managing the impact that your idea could have, right? Which is, you know, what is the level of impact we could have if it turned out that we became successful? And then the level of risk that you're managing is a different kind of risk, which is the risk that this idea that you have might fail, even if it sounds convincing when you first start planning it. And so the question is just like, in the space we are, in the industry we are, or in the kind of work we do, how comfortable are we with managing this kind of risk, right? Okay, cool. So let's move on to the next principle. The second principle is, when it comes to innovation, leaders cannot pick the winning idea on day one. this is really foundational, right? This is where things start to break, where it's like, well, I've been in this industry for 25 years. That will never work. Let's do this other thing. This is the big idea. And so that's why you see like governments and politicians and heads of think tanks, they keep coming up with all these ideas and sort of foisting them on people because they think they can pick the winning idea on day one. And that's a real, real problem. So I want to take you to the sort of, sort of think about it, right? You sort of start with uncertainty, and as you get closer, because you're using an iterative process, you cannot pick the winning idea on day one. It's impossible to pick the winning idea on day one if you're dealing with uncertainty. The best example that's sort of been studied of this is what I'm going to show you now, which is venture capital seed investing. This is in the VC industry. It's the best kind of data we have about how good are you at picking winners. If you're a venture capitalist, it's your job to pick winners every day. Just remember this, right? That they get pitched ideas every day. So it's their job to be like their survival depends on picking winners. So the question for you is, how many $100,000 seed investments does it take to produce a mega success? How many bets would you have to make to produce one mega success? And that's the second poll that we're going to launch so that people can see. So you can choose, do you need to make 10 $100,000 bets? Do you need to make 100, 500, 1,000? I can see the votes coming in. If you had to make $100,000 bet, isn't that like $1 billion or something? That's a lot of that's a lot of money, right? Okay, awesome. So if you can share the results, all the votes are in now. Winning a number there is 500. So people think that you need to make 500 bets in order to be successful. That's really interesting, right? Because that's a lot of bets. So let's 10 is too small. That's what I would say up front. So let's so you can stop sharing, and I can show you the results from the data that we've studied from the venture capitalist. So if you want to have one major success or something that becomes really, 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 successful, you need to make at least $150,000 in investments. And when you do that, 162 of those will fail outright. Like they'll just lose money, and 87 of those will become somewhat successful. And we get this data from from Correlation Ventures and Venture Source, and all they're showing is that like when you want to get really high returns, you have to make loads of bets. So some venture capitalists will say they work with a 1/3 rule, right? 1/3 of their investments will fail, 1/3 will give them back the money they invested, and then another third will have the impact that they're hoping to have. Now, I'm not saying that do this in your space. That's not what I'm saying. I'm doing this to illustrate the principle that you can't pick winning ideas on day one. So if you think about it, right? Think about your explore portfolio. Rather than always make one big bet, we always wanted to choose the winning idea on day one. Think about it as like a collection of sort of bets that you then guide along this journey. Maybe you start with 10 teams because that's the space we are. So you start with 10 ideas, and then 6 of those ideas make it to the next phase. And then only 2 of those ideas become really successful innovations that have the impact that we're hoping to have on the world. So if this is what we're trying to create, what this means is that leaders can't pick winners on day one. All leaders can do is create the conditions for the winning ideas to emerge. Right? And that's really, really fundamental. You have to create the space in which exploration happens, and then you can really start to drive innovation in the right way. Okay, so let's move on to the next principle, which is another interesting principle. In this principle, it's the notion that we know that we can't pick the winning ideas on day one. So if we create the context in which the winning ideas emerge, what are we looking for, right? And what we're looking for is success that always goes beyond R&D and technology. Have you ever been in one? I'm sure you've been in those meetings where the person just wants AI or mobile. Like we need to do something about, because most homeless folks have mobile phones. So we need to do something with mobile phones. Right? They're just so focused on the technology or the R&D or whatever it is that they forget that it's creative and inventive when it's an idea. It becomes an innovation when it has impact. So you always have to be thinking beyond just the idea. You have to be thinking beyond the idea. And so here's what I want you to do, which is the last poll. So this is a really interesting one. It makes pharmaceutical people very angry sometimes when I show these people in the pharma industry. What do you think is the relationship between how much companies invest in R&D and the returns they get? All right? Do you think it's zero? Do you think it's a weak relationship, or do you think it's a strong relationship? How much companies invest in R&D and the returns that they get from that R&D. Okay, interesting to see the results emerging there. A lot of people saying strong. Okay. Cool, we can stop the poll and share the results. And as you can see, nobody picked zero, right? But actually, if you can stop sharing that, zero is the right answer, right? So if you stop sharing that, you can see from the results here that zero is actually the right answer. And the way I discovered this, by the way, is I was working with this R&D department, and the head of the R&D department was asking me to go figure out how much money they should get from their leaders, in order to invest in R&D. And as I was digging in, I discovered that actually there's no correlation between how much money companies return on how much companies invest in R&D and how much returns they get. Now, here's the takeaway. When you see a zero correlation, what it means is that some people get returns and some people don't for a similar amount of investment. So the question is, what distinguishes those people that get returns from their R&D investments and those that don't? That's where the answer to innovation then starts to really sort of work, and we can really see why it's actually good for us. And so innovation, successful innovation, is the combination of creating stakeholder value. So you can either be a painkiller or a vitamin or whatever you want, but you have to create value for the stakeholders with which you're working. So it's not sufficient just to say, oh, look, we have this shiny object. It's an AI thing. And what it does is it tracks movements of money or whatever it is, right? You can't do that. You have to think about what is the value we want to create for the stakeholders. And then the second question you have to answer is, how sustainable is the value that you're creating? So do you have a mission model? We often call it business model in the industry, but for nonprofits, we call it a mission model. Do you have a mission model that allows the value you're creating to be sustainable and repeatable? Once you complete this equation, we say you've actually got a successful innovation. And that's what we should be leading towards, right? And that's really, really important because, Alexander Osterwalder, who's my mentor, created the Business Model Canvas, which is this tool that sort of assesses how an organization creates value, delivers value, and captures value. And this is what it looks like. You can see that there's customer segments, customer relationships, channels, et cetera, et cetera. But for in the nonprofit sector, we have to be thinking about, well, okay, what is the business model for that? So people that have been working with this have invented and have sort of improved this tool and created a tool called the Mission Model Canvas, which changes customer segments, right, to beneficiaries, right? It also changes customer relationships to buy-in and support. It changes channels to how do we deploy this. It changes revenue streams to the mission or impact that we want to create. And then it changes cost structures to the mission budget, because we know we're sort of managing budgets and the costs that we're trying to manage there. And so this is the Mission Model Canvas. And when we work with nonprofits, this is what we use. And what we say to them is, this is the atomic unit for innovation. This is the smallest piece of innovation. You have to be solving for a successful mission model, rather than just solving for launch. We launched an app, we launched a thing, we launched a program, we launched a, right? We really need to be thinking about the impact that is having, which leads us to this principle. Don't just focus on launching your programs or working on your ideas. Search and find a sustainable mission model. And then we call those people who do this well, the successful innovators, right? And that's where innovation becomes good for you, because you're not just working on a whole bunch of ideas, you're launching things that actually have impact. And so this is a process we use when we're working with teams. We have this principle, we say, design like you're right. So come up with your really great ideas, prototype your ideas, assess the prototype to see how crazy your ideas are. But Once you've come, and most people stop here and then they make a business plan. We have a second principle that forces people to really think about this, which is test like you're wrong. So design like you're right, but test like you're wrong. And that's how you become successful innovation. So extract hypotheses and assumptions, run experiments or pilots, learn, iterate until you find something that has actual impact on the world. And that's really the discipline that we want to bring. And as you're managing this discipline, what we say is you're sort of reducing the risk of the innovations that you're working on. And as you're reducing the risk, we start with small bets, and then we increase the level of investment in any program, depending on the level of success it's actually showing us. And that's how we move from exploration to that becoming something that we put in our exploitation portfolio. So it's sort of a balanced discipline that we bring there. And so it's really been a pleasure to speak to you all. In order for this to happen, you need organizations that are obviously geared up to actually do this. And so one of the questions we often ask people, or we often ask leaders, is how much time do you personally spend on innovation every week? And we often find that leaders are not really paying attention to that. There's so much in the operations. And so, Alexander Osterwalder to put this out, and the majority of people spend less than 10% on innovation. And this is an unbalanced leadership style. And we need our leaders to be much more focused on thinking about this. Another measure we use to see how important innovation is to organizations is the last poll that I'm going to give you today before I stop talking, which is, when you think of the innovation teams inside your organization, how easy would it be for leaders in your organization to get rid of these teams, to disband them? Do you think it would be as difficult as getting rid of a key function like finance, or as easy as firing external consultants? How easy do you think it would be within your organization? I love this poll. Given that I'm a consultant myself, it makes me feel a bit sad sometimes. Okay, awesome. So we have the results, so you can share the results. Okay, great. And you can see 60%. Wow, well, yeah, almost 90% are saying external consultants. So that's interesting, and you can stop sharing that, because that's similar to what we get as well. The majority of the time, innovation is treated as a sideshow, something to do on the side, but we have to figure out a way to balance this within our organizations. And the way to bring the balance into the organization is to think about innovation and measure it by how much value it actually creates. And then we can connect it to our missions as organizations. So thank you very much. I look forward to having the rest of the conversation. This has been fun. Cheers.
Tendai, that was wonderful, and it is a sobering final question on the poll to leave us with, because my experience, I was a little heartbroken in organizations when I moved on, and I saw the subsequent leadership could dismantle the things that I thought of as the people who were really stimulating the innovation within the organization, and they just unplugged it, and it was really discouraging to see how fast the culture could shift back. Yes. And so that's a great it's a good challenge to put to this conversation about how do we make organizations sustain this kind of culture. So let me go over to Marisi. And Marisi, please tell folks just a word or two about yourself, and then we'd love to hear your reactions to what Tendai has shared.
Hi, everybody. I'm just starting a timer so I don't go overboard. My name is Marisi Vinton, and it is an honor to be here. So I am a current trustee for the center. So it's great to be a part of the Impact Festival and the mission. I currently run an organization called Ada's List. We are a global community for women and people who identify as women who work in or around technology. And we're about almost 7 years old. And so I've recently quit my job to run that full time. My background is in government technology. Government, you might say innovation, if you will. So I worked in the Obama campaign in 2008 and moved to Washington, D.C. to work in the administration and bring the hope and change to life. As part of that, I set up the technology and digital team for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so kind of in my response today to Tendai's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about government, because I've worked and experienced changing government firsthand. when we set up the CFPB, which is a regulatory body, financial regulatory body, it was a fascinating time where we were not only building an institution to respond to the financial crisis of 2008, but for those of us on the tech team, we were also aware that we were building an institution that would live much longer than us, and that what we were creating, the practices, the procedures, the technology, that was going to become legacy soon. So while we might have been the innovative, thinkers and startup-y kids and policy wonks and financial regulators, which we were, how could we transmit that culture of innovation and that culture of thinking big into a government organization that was going to one day become a bureaucracy? And I think what's a lot of the lessons that today is talked about are really important. It's more of a mindset, I think, is in my approach, and it's more of how you enable inside an organization to bring that change to life. How do you create the capacity internally to then deliver on any of the innovation programs that you have going on? And I think that is really important. When you're looking at government and you're looking at bureaucracies, you also need to be able to make decisions quickly. And so fundamentally, when I was listening to Tunde's talk, Tunde, I was thinking about decision making. Like, you didn't mention that a lot. Like, fundamentally, the success of any of this is going to rely on the ability of the organization to say yes or no, stick to that decision, and then create that plan to do it. And obviously that plan's got to be built, through the models that you shared, built around data, built around testing and trialing, built around customers. But I think that's a really important ability that government struggles in. Why am I talking about government? I'm talking about government because today we're brought together by the Center for Homelessness Impact. And when we're thinking about the homelessness crisis and emergency, government is at the center of that. And it's one of the most complex areas that I've ever, I've been a trustee for almost a year, and it's one of the most complex areas that we are trying to make a dent in and eventually solve. And it's not about one government institution, it's about multiple government institutions at a local and at a central level here in the UK. But then there's partners, and then the partners of partners. And so what you're really trying to do is create the capacity and the decision-making in that sector to solve a problem. And how do you do that? And I think a lot of the models that Tunde shared are useful. I think I took a screenshot of one of them with the design and test one. I mean, fundamentally, when you have a program or initiative like that brings all these stakeholders and all these partners together to solve a problem. I know that the center actually is looking at doing a lot of that and is doing a lot of pilots right now with coronavirus. The coronavirus is impacting, every sector of our lives, but it's obviously impacting the homelessness sector in ways that, we're only beginning to understand, or we have a insight into, but it's only a small fraction of probably what's actually going on. And what the center is doing is they are piloting solutions and they are working with councils. And I think that that's a clever way to approach such a complex and effing critical problem right now. And they are using, I don't think, I don't want to speak for Lygia, I don't think they use the word innovation. They use the word pilot, and that's the way to do it. And they're really focused on their mission around how do we increase the capacity in our organizations to make the decisions that are required to do these pilots, and then hopefully take those to scale. And Lydia, jump in the chat if I'm getting anything wrong. I'm not here to represent you by any means, but I think it's important when we think about how you take the models that Tunde has talked about and you look at government and then you look at what you guys are trying to achieve. It's all coming together in really important ways. So I think what's helpful about what has been presented is that it helps provide a bit of a framework or path for organizations that are trying to tackle these super complex systemic problems boil it down to one thing and then hope that that one thing is part of a bigger solution that you can take to scale. I cede my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie-C. And
For
so
the
that,
government nerds.
right? And we're all fascinated. Like I'm getting closer and closer to my screen, ready to jump in. But let me turn it over now to Allison Watson. And Allison, please also give give everybody a little bit more on your background, and let's hear about the perspective from the homeless sector.
Thanks very much, Tendai and Marie-C. That was absolutely brilliant. It's going to be difficult to follow that, but we're really interested to try and back the themes around. I'm Alison Watson, Director of Shelter Scotland. I've been working in health, social care, housing services for about 30 years. And I think I've always probably been somebody who doesn't accept the way that things are. So innovation is a really interesting topic for me. Fascinating set of views that have already been expressed. I think where we sit with the development of services in homelessness in Scotland at the moment, this is a very timely debate, because I think there's a very interesting conversation about how do you drive real and lasting change? How much of that is about changing the system? How much of that is driving the new stuff? So I'd be really interested if we can get into some of that. And then going back to what you were saying, Tendai, absolutely fascinating. There was lots of that resonated. A couple of things really resonated very strongly. That introductory comment, how do you create value and not noise? And I think that is really relevant in terms of innovation in homelessness services. And then relating that to another key point you made about how do you know the difference that you're making? And I suppose that's part of my interest in today's discussion. I really liked you talking about what is innovation, what is it, Tendai? But I'm also really interested in what's it for? What's the point of innovation? So that's something that really interests me about the discussion today. And I think looking at my experience of innovation in homelessness services in Shelter Scotland, I think there's a tendency in our sector to think about innovation as new stuff, as new services. And I think sometimes my experience of innovation has taken me to a point where I think how we do things and innovation around how feels as important as the what part of it, the what that we're actually doing. And just picking up on one of the things that you were saying, Marie-C, about creating capacity. When I think about the most successful innovations that we've done at Shelter Scotland, I think working with partners has always been key to that. It's not something we hold on to ourselves. It's something we reach out to other stakeholders on and say, how do we do this together? Both in terms of the new thing, but also how do we use the learning? How do we take that forward? And the second thing, which I think is absolutely critical for me, is co-production. So working with people who've got the lived experience of the problem that we're trying to tackle, both in terms of the design and delivery, but also the evaluation of the innovative thing that we're doing. And I think co-production for me is absolutely essential to making sure that we focus on the stuff that will make the biggest difference. And I think it can counteract that tendency that we can get into to think about innovation as the rocket science end of the spectrum, the whiz bang stuff. And I think we can all get into that, partly because it's exciting, but also because politicians love that stuff. And for charities, we have to recognise funders love that stuff. So we just sometimes need to think about how do we, in a valid way and in a way that we can validate, focus on the stuff that will make real and lasting change. And I think co-production for me feels really essential to that. And I think it relates to some of my thoughts about scaling up, because I think at Shelter Scotland, we tend to take a pretty critical view of scaling up. So we don't go into a piece of work assuming that it will be something that needs to be scaled up. And even if it does need to be scaled up, we don't assume that we're the best people to do it. And that's back to your points, Marie-C, about capacity partners. Other people might be better placed than Shelter Scotland to take that forward. But I think there's also something really key about recognising that using innovation isn't always just about doing more of it. I think we've quite often in Shelter Scotland taken a view about it's the learning from the innovation, the insight. It enables us to see something differently, and we can then engage with key stakeholders to say, well, what do we do with that? Now, an example of that was a project that we ran several years ago called Safe and Sound. It was working with young people who ran away from home. And we did that because when you look at statistics, and I'm sure it's the same in the US as it is across the UK, young people are always vastly overrepresented in the homelessness statistics by a ratio of about 2 to 1. And when you look at young people who are homeless, at least 50% of them have run away from home at least once, and quite a lot of them have run away from home on several occasions. So you can start identifying the youngsters who are going to be the homeless adults of the future. And that's what our Safe and Sound service was trying to do, drive a different approach in working with youngsters who were running away. Incredibly successful program. We didn't choose to scale it up. What we chose to do was work with the Scottish Government and the police in Scotland to say, what is the learning from this? And what that led to was the creation of Scotland's first national framework on missing people. So it was taking one project just in one part of the country, but actually saying, how can we influence practice and service design right across the country? And I'd probably just want to finish off with just trying to draw a more general point from that, because I think innovation can sometimes highlight the need for a structural change. And that is my kind of voice of caution on this, as I said earlier, because politicians and funders will pay more attention to the shiny buttons on the coat. They won't necessarily look at, is the coat actually fit for purpose? And when I apply that to homeless services, one of the things that strikes me is, going back to your points, Tindy, about how do we make the biggest difference? We cannot lose sight of the fact that in terms of homelessness, the thing that will make the biggest difference is more affordable housing. So you can have all the innovation that you want. If you don't have the houses for people to live in, you haven't ended homelessness. And in Scotland, this has real resonance because we have the most progressive set of rights on homelessness in the world. It sounds dramatic, it's actually true. But even before the pandemic, we'd had 2 consecutive increases in homelessness. So rights alone, innovation alone, are not going to deliver the real and lasting change that we want. So in order for people to sense that that right to a home will become a reality, there needs to be enough affordable housing. So I just offer those comments as some of the way of hopefully taking forward some of the big themes from your really fascinating talk, Tindy, and picking up on some of your points about, particularly around that capacity issue, Marisi, which I'm really interested in, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Alison. 2 amazing responses. And Tindy, before I jump in with questions, I'm sure you have a ton of responses. Would you like to just give some thoughts and reaction to those comments?
Yeah, so 2 quick things, right? So, you know, there's like a hype cycle, right? Where people think they understand the meaning of a word or something, but they're using it in a way that's not really typically what how practitioners use the word. So there's stuff that we now call in our business innovation theater, which is things that look like innovation but create no value. So labs with sticky notes and apps and all these things. And people are like, yeah, we launched the app. And then you invite the prime minister and they're like, look at this app. It's going to track and trace, whatever. But it doesn't really track or trace. And so all of these things are like, you know, it's a bit crazy, right? So that's what we call innovation theater. And a lot of people spend money on the theater of innovation. And we really need to make a distinction. And the distinction is that something only becomes considered a successful innovation the moment it has impact. Before that, we're just playing around with ideas. So that distinction is really, really important. And so that's why we say to innovation teams, your job is not to generate ideas. Your job is to search for inventive ways to create value, right? And the only way you can find inventive ways to create value is to focus on the mission model rather than your idea. And in the mission model, there's boxes there about key partners. If that's the risky assumption, you have to go test that because you can't scale without key partners. There's stuff about the environment. There's stuff about the value proposition to the beneficiary, which forces you to co-create with the beneficiary because you have to understand exactly what they need. So all these behaviors become, in my experience, extracted by the lens through which you start to tell people how you're going to judge the success of the stuff they're doing. Launch is not sufficient. Impact is what we celebrate, and that's the discipline we try to bring to the conversation.
So here's the question I've been struggling with in listening to everybody's comments, which is how, as a leader or a member of an organization, how do you contribute to changing the culture of the organization such that innovation isn't thought of as something that those people down the hall in that room do, and then they let us know how it goes, but it's actually something that's part of the entire culture, and how it does get embedded and doesn't get excised when there's a leadership change. And how does that, what are strategies perhaps that any of us have seen where we've seen that really become kind of so deeply seated that it's hard to get rid of?
Linda, I'd probably jump in there. This is it's a very timely question. At Shelter Scotland, we're having a pretty intentional conversation about culture right now. So, you know, this really resonates for me. And that's because we're just over a year into our 3-year strategy. And the strategy that we've committed to, I would describe as transformational, because we're changing both what we do and how we do it. And in order to deliver something that's so different, we have to think about our culture, our behaviours, our values. How do we equip ourselves? Back to your point where you say about capacity, how do we have the right capacity at Shelter Scotland to deliver? And I think there's actually been an opportunity in a way created by the pandemic to really accelerate some of our thinking around this, because like all organisations, when lockdown happened, overnight, we had to change all of our ways of doing things. That became essential. There was no choice about that. So it's enabled me to have a completely different context with staff about how do we do things. If we understand culture as the way we do things right around here, well, that just changed overnight. So it's created a fluidity about that conversation. And I think particularly with everybody in our organisation, working remotely, home working, creating that connectivity across staff and across teams has been really important. So the culture I'm trying to drive as a leader is developing a culture of sharing. And it's saying we still have the same goals, but we're going to have to do things differently to now pursue those goals. We don't know how long we're going to be working remotely. We don't know how long restrictions like social distancing are going to last. But that to me feels key. It's saying, you know, a key part of my responsibility as a leader to say, what are the big things we should be doing? It's not my business, and I'm not best placed to then determine how we do things. And I want the innovation, I want those decisions about how we do things to be taken as close to where the activity happens. So it's really making those kind of distinctions that I think for me are starting to make that difference, Linda.
And it's such an interesting point. You make me, I managed through 2 major emergencies in New York City, blackout and a hurricane. And it was just amazing to me how those emergency situations suddenly just open the doors to creative solutions. It's almost like you don't have a choice. You can't just keep doing what you were doing. And then different people also step forward and take a stronger role. But it's like, it always makes me wonder, like, how can we create an environment where it's almost like I don't want to create a perpetual emergency, but why is it that it takes an emergency to allow creative new things to get tried? And Marisi, I see you had lots of reactions, so please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's the toughest question of them all, because fundamentally it's a mindset, right? It is a mindset that translates into a culture and vice versa. I think it's a cycle. Like, you want to perpetuate the mindset that is positive. And actually, Allison, I've been thinking about what I said about capacity, and in many ways, I think capacity can be a mindset. And I think, and what I mean by that specifically, and I'll use an example with coronavirus. So for example, with schools and education, I think there's a number of things that we can be trialing that are low cost or no cost, but there's no capacity in the system to, even at the local level, to take on a project and a program like that. And actually, I think there is. So I think it's a mindset. And how do we create that mindset and that culture where people feel like they can actually say yes emotionally, not just physically, if that makes any sense. But I think one of the things that I wrote down when you asked that question, Linda, is how you can do that is, first of all, as a leader, or if you're somebody in the mid-management don't just listen to the people that look like you or talk like you or have your background. I think that it's really easy, especially in a policy position, to only surround yourself with people that think just like you. And that's how you get to where we are in many ways. And I think the other way that you can do that is you focus on the really super specific, narrow impact that you want. Tendai talked a lot about innovation and ideas, and that's fine if those lead to the impact. And so if you focus on that problem, that specific problem you're trying to solve. So my education example, it's a very specific outdoor learning in case of a second wave, like super specific. I'm not interested in random warehouses. I'm interested in like, how do we keep outdoor learning year round for kids that need it? And that's how that would be my example of how you focus on the project and or on the outcome you want to have, because it's really easy in an environment when people are like, oh, creativity and ideas and let's complicate things. But I think you got to focus down to the most easily testable thing to get, a bunch of people to rally around. But that's also how you can help people, is when they've got an idea in your organization, instead of saying no, they might just need some support getting that idea down, distilled down to its most basic component, which is what is the problem you're trying to solve.
It reminds me of a colleague of mine his name is Adam Burke. I used to work with him at Pearson when we were at the large educational company. And we used to call him, Adam, what problem are you trying to solve, Burke? Because every time anybody came up with an innovation, you'd just say, okay, cool, that looks really good, but what problem are you trying to solve? And then people don't actually know. They think you're going to be impressed by the fact that the thing is bang whiz, but he's asking you, what problem are you trying to solve? And then if you can come up with a problem, then he'll ask you two other questions. Who has that problem? And how do you know? And that takes you to another level, right? Which, so I think that's really where the discipline of innovation is actually really, really, really supposed to go. And then just one last thing, the example you gave about the crisis, my favorite story is the Great Fire of London, and how like when the city burnt down, there was all these ideas about how to rebuild. Anyone who's driven in London knows how crazy it is to try and drive in London. Like if you take the wrong turn, you end up in another part, like it's not on a grid system. So they thought, oh, the city burnt down, a chance to redesign a great city. And so they came up with all these plans, and then they couldn't do it. Like people just built their houses right back where they were before. So, after a crisis, it's not always inevitable that the things we did during a crisis start to take hold. And the reason is simply because like the battles we fight is to give innovation teams legitimacy. Like nobody challenges that the finance team should be there, or the HR team should be there, or the fundraising team should be there. But the innovation team is always viewed as something dispensable. But if we start to focus on them creating impact, we then maybe start to raise their status within the organization. It's a really important piece of how we do business here. And that's really the work that we try to do.
So I want to ask another question, and this is that's closely related, but having worked for 30 years in government, local government, the tolerance for failure is low, and the cycles are short. A new elected leader only has a very short amount of time to make an impact, and so piloting can be seen as a bad word because it's not going to have the kind of scale impact in my city. And by the way, the worst thing that you can do as a leader is to, get yourself on the front page of some newspaper with some spectacular failure. And I'm a chronic failer. I have a high degree of risk. But it hasn't been pretty, and so let's talk a little bit about that. How to tolerate innovation and trial and failure in the government sector with the lives of people who, you're not testing a product about whether people want to wear a new pair of sneakers. You're actually impacting people's lives. And maybe Alison, let's start with you on that one.
Really recognise the dilemma. I think it's a dilemma right across the charity sector, the not-for-profit sector that I work in. And I think one of the things that we've really had to do at Shelter Scotland is be quite robust in our decision making about when we'll do something. Sounds really simple, but it's just really putting ourselves under a bit of extra pressure, because I think when resources are constrained and you see some new pot of money on the horizon, it's very tempting to run towards that. And I think we've really challenged ourselves to say, hang on, you know, back to what you were saying, Tendai, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What's the point of the innovation? What's the change that we're trying to make, and how we will make that? So it's always kind of thinking about things from a design point of view. And I think for us, it's making decisions about when we'll do something, but also making decisions about when we won't do something, because we don't feel we can do it well enough, or we feel that actually will not get listened to, it will not drive the difference, it will not make the difference that we're seeking. And I think when we do decide to do stuff, there is a real value we've learned in making sure that you have independent income to support that innovation, because you get to define your terms. And I think working with partners is another key part of that, because it's saying there are a number of us all saying the same thing and that it needs to be done in the same way. But at the end of the day, I think the thing that's always made the biggest difference in the context of the problem that you're talking about, for me, goes back to co-production, because it's who do politicians pay attention to? Now, they're going to pay more attention to people saying, this worked for me, this was a problem I had, this made a difference in my life, and you can't tell me otherwise. So people who've lived the problem are always going to give you the most influence. So I think involving people who've got the lived experience of the problem or the challenge in the design and delivery, and also the evaluation of what you do, and then in the promotion of what you do, I think is absolutely essential. So it's not people like myself at Shelters Scotland who could be kind of written off as policy wonks or experts. Politicians can't do that with people who've said, this is actually making a real difference to people like me, you cannot not do this. So that self-advocacy, that collective advocacy, I think is really important to getting cut through with your ideas and getting airtime for them.
And it's worth adding that a lot of times governments can benefit from the somewhat distance of the community-based organizations. That so innovation happening at the community at the local level then can be those lessons can be scaled up by the central government when if they're looking for, you know, kind of search the environment and see what's working out there. And so it can also be like a testing ground for the government to then scale. But Marisa, you must think a lot about the political cycle and getting the Consumer Financial Protection Board off the ground.
Yeah, I think so. I think that in addition to the short-termism that comes with politicians and politics in general, is that they're also often surrounded by really great, well-meaning employees who are there to keep things the way they are. And that's good. That generally comes from a good place. That generally comes from a place of love and stability. But I think that it also requires a lot of organizational discipline from those top leaders to say, actually, no, this is the direction that we're going in. I am here for a very short period of time, and this organization needs to be wired in an ability to make decisions and stick with them at every level, you know, in this time. And so I think that that's kind of how I think one way you can better tackle that. I think as a leader, I would always, or coaching a leader, I would always suggest that you have X number of short-term goals and the next number of long-term goals, and point all of your organization towards that. A radical approach, which I've never seen any government do, probably the closest now is coronavirus, is that you sign up to solve a problem in 6 months, and you throw that, you know, the non-business as usual capacity that you have at solving that problem for 6 months, and then copy paste next problem. I think that would be another interesting approach, but probably wouldn't be too popular with voters.
And so it's so voters. Oh yeah, we have to remember them. So there's a couple of questions popping up in the question box that really is around how to convince the leadership. And I would say the leadership is both the heads of the agencies, as well as the elected officials, as well as the legislative bodies. what's the strategy to gain their buy-in and make them champions of this I was going to say champions of change. I don't know if that might counter some of your lessons, Tendai. How to be champions of innovation that produce value.
Yeah, so it's funny you should say that, because I work with corporations and they don't have 4 years, they have next quarter. So their timeline is even shorter. So you have to look good all the time. And so the best way to look good all the time is to always separate your quarterly reporting with the work that you're doing on innovation. So I like your idea of let's run experiments in small spaces over here and then only bubble up the things that we think might have impact. So I'm trying to imagine a world where, you know how like when a politician turns up on their first day in the job and they look for the finance guy because they want to know how much money they have to spend, right? If innovation had that level of legitimacy, the politician would also turn up and say, after speaking to finance, can you send me the innovation guys? Because I want to know what things they've been testing that are closer to having impact so I can scale those things. And so then it just becomes this sort of portfolio management of like taking the things, because what we do when we're working with large organizations is we say, stop paying attention to the small level experiments, put them in a lab or some place where they don't really have a massive impact on the bigger company. And then we'll bring you evidence of those things that are more aligned to your reporting structure, that are closer to scaling. And then you take those things, like what Alison was saying, bring the people that have been benefiting, and then that's what you use as leverage to influence for those things to become.
And I love that point. And I think we struggle with this a lot in the government program field. There's such a heavy push. So many dollars are just going out to programs year after year after year that have no evidence. And so we are making as strong a case as we can to move dollars toward evidence-based programming. But then what that can do is actually stifle innovation, because of course an innovation doesn't have evidence because you have to pilot it and test it and produce the information. And so it's this tension between evidence-based practice, which government needs to get better at, without stifling innovation. So growing both at the same time. And so a little bit of an answer was there in your comment that we're building on collectively here, which is testing grounds, small places, thinking maybe of like the sector, not as government and then the partners of the community-based organizations, but it's the entire field, and the CBOs together with government constitute the field. But I'm interested in this this struggle, and it's the classic struggle that the Center for Homelessness Impact is trying to balance of innovation versus evidence-based practice.
What I would say to that is the way you solve that dilemma is in the amounts you spend. So there's money that's spent on scaling, where you need evidence-based for that level of investment because it's a lot. And then there's amounts of money you spend on small experiments, and you make small bets. And so you resolve that dilemma by investing in small experiments and pilots, and that's a small amount of investment. And then as they gather evidence, you then invest the big dollars. So that's where the balance often sits as we're working with organizations.
I mean, just some thoughts on that, Linda, because I think, again, that really resonates for me. We are a political organisation, we're a campaigning organisation, we're always trying to think about how to influence decision makers. And I suppose there's always a bit for me in terms of how to get buy-in, as you're talking about it, that buy-in can be about understanding, well, what problems are those politicians, what problems are the government bodies trying to solve, and demonstrate how your solution is part of doing that. But I think sometimes it's also about demonstrating that you're solving a problem that they don't think they have, or that they don't recognise they have. So if I apply that to the comments I made earlier about the importance of affordable housing, social housing, I think for us it's about politicians will recognise that that has a role in solving homelessness, in enabling people to move on from homelessness situations. But at the moment we've got a very acute concern about the impact of the pandemic on the economy. So we're working hard to demonstrate how building social homes has a role in supporting the economic recovery from the pandemic. We know from our partners that for every social home built, it creates 4 jobs. We know from some other research partners that Also, this has a really strong role to play in tackling child poverty, which is a big concern for Scottish Government at the moment. If you reduce housing costs, you help poverty. So it's just trying to reframe your arguments so that politicians kind of have that aha moment and recognise that this is solving a problem that they want to solve, but it's maybe solving a problem they didn't realise they had.
And we're at the top of the hour. Marisi, we have 1 minute. I maybe offer you the closing word. You're good? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. This is fantastic. What I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk with all of you this morning. You can see the sun has come up in New York over the course of this hour. So I can, and my husband just bought me a fresh cup of coffee. I'm ready to get going. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Center for Homelessness Impact for sponsoring this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It was a real pleasure.